Walter spent hours daily with Elon Musk for a long time, and now he's sharing what he learned. He also talked about Elon's demon mode, which I haven't really heard about before. This was a fascinating conversation. I highly recommend that you watch or listen to the whole thing. This whole conversation is based on everything that is going to be in this book of 600 pages of never heard before stories about Elon Musk, and I'm definitely getting my hands on one copy. You can already pre-order it. A big shout out to the Best of Live Audio for doing this conversation with Walter. I highly recommend that you follow that Twitter account to not miss out on any more conversations like this one.
Tell us how this whole idea of writing a biography about Elon Musk came about for you.
It was a mutual acquaintance of mine, Antonio Gracias, who was on his board. I'd just done a book on Jennifer Doudna, who helped invent the technology called CRISPR, which allows us to gene edit. And I was interested in finding another innovator, and he put me in touch with Musk. We talked for about an hour on the phone, and I said, look, if I do this book, I don't want to just have 10 interviews or 20 interviews. I want to be by your side for 2.5 years. Every meeting, I want to just shadow you so I can see it in operation. And secondly, I don't want you to have any control over this book, and I don't want you to even read it in advance. And when he agreed to that, I said, well, here's a guy doing rocket ships, a guy doing batteries, bringing us into the era of electric vehicles, a true person pushing the boundaries of manufacturing innovation. I said, this sounds great. I said, okay, I think I'll do it. And at the end of the conversation, he said, oh, okay, do you mind if I tell a few people? I said, no, that would not be a problem. And I walked back down from where I was talking to him. A group of people I knew were hanging out. And they said, oh, my God, oh, my God. And I said, what's that? He said, well, we keep getting email messages that you're doing Elon Musk. And at the end of our conversation, he tweeted out a tweet, which you could probably find on Twitter, saying, if you're interested, Walter Isaacson's doing my biography. So I guess that kind of locked me into it when I saw that tweet. But it's been a really fascinating ride.
Oh, I love that. And of course, it started with a tweet. So before we dive into more of that work with Elon himself, I want to get kind of the whole story. Kind of before you have conversations with Elon, how do you generally think about writing a story, writing a biography, like the ones that you've done before for Steve Jobs and things like that have informed you for this one? But before you started talking with Elon, how did you start thinking or planning and researching ahead of time?
Well, with a live subject like Musk, you start talking to all the people who've dealt with him and all around him. But in this case, I really dove right into it. As soon as he said, let's begin, I was down in Boca Chica near Brownsville, walking the lines where he was building the Starship for SpaceX and visiting the Gigafactory and that was being built in Austin and hanging out in Hawthorne, California. So this one really began not by doing background research, but by just diving into the deep end of being with him all steps of the way. And one of the things he did that was very transparent, he said, I'm going to just tell everybody to talk to you. And I said, even your adversaries, your enemies, even the Martin Eberhards you've had struggles with, even your former wives, he said, everybody. And so I think I talked to 250 people quite
Wow.
extensively for this book, but he was quite encouraging that everybody, including people he had fired or people he got along with, should talk to
So it
me.
seems like, Walter, you pretty much had full access. It doesn't seem like there's any restrictions whatsoever, and he's providing that to you. Is that right?
Yeah, it's full access, and he's made very few restraints. To be honest with you, the restraints are almost self-imposed ones, things that either involve children under the age of 18 that may be juicy but may not be relevant. Some of the stuff is relevant, or sometimes financial forward-looking information. I just keep my mouth shut on that. But generally, he said, just use your good judgment.
Ooh, I like that. I like that. Okay, so what were some of the complexities as you think back over the 2.5 years of working with him and talking with him and all of these people? I think you said 250 of them. Were there one, two, three or so of the bigger complexities? What were those for you through this experience?
I always write about people who are smart, but being smart is a dime a dozen. What really matters is being innovative, being questioning every requirement, being rebellious, taking risks. And that's what a lot of great innovators, starting with Leonardo da Vinci, have in common. With Musk, he has an amazingly good engineering mind, but the difficulty, as anybody who's dealt with him knows, and he's self aware enough to know, is he has a very dark streak to it. He has a dark streak coming out of a very brutal childhood, a violent childhood, a childhood in which he had very strong psychological difficulties with his father. His father also has a very dark streak to him, sometimes called demon mode by that's what Claire Boucher, Musk's uh, friend, calls it. And so watching him go into demon mode with a real lack of empathy. And, his brother Kimball is over endowed with empathy. But I think that Elon is not either endowed or burdened with empathy. And so he can be a much tougher leader. So I tend to be kind of an easygoing, always want people around me to like me type. And watching somebody who did not care about anything except the mission of getting something done. Uh, that's what I have to weave into this book because there are light strands and brilliant strands with Musk, but also dark strands. And as a biographer, you get to the complexity of, and normally in life, we can say, okay, we admire the good parts of the person and we don't like the dark strands in the person. The biographer has to try to figure out how are those strands woven together. So you can't just pluck out the strands, say, I wish he wouldn't be so impulsive, or I wish he wouldn't tweet nasty things. If you pluck out that strand, you'll lose the whole cloth. And that's what this biography is about.
Ooh, so let's dive in a little bit more about your relationship with Elon. How did that evolve over time from the beginning towards the end? Of course, things probably changed amongst that, but also, what is your process for developing a relationship with a source or the figure that you're focusing on?
I try to stay in the background. I'm at a lot of things. Musk, as you know, lapses into silences sometimes where he's batch processing information he's gotten over the past hour or two. And you learn not to fill the silences. You just sit there. And our relationship was one where I was an observer and a fly on the wall. I didn't go out drinking with him and I didn't try to be his buddy. But he was then more and more open as he saw that I was just going about the task of doing the book.
Were there, it makes me think about you just mentioned like going out to a bar at the same time just having a formal conversation with him. Were there times or ways of having these conversations that you found like that were just better conversations? Maybe it was when it was you and him, it was one-on-one quiet, or maybe you're walking the floor of a Tesla factory. When were those moments of just pure connection? Almost, I can't imagine they were all perfect per se, but tell us a little bit more about that.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, what happens is you develop a spidey sense sometimes of when does he want to talk and when not. And it could be 3 in the morning or 2 in the morning by phone. He'll be around. We'll be texting each other, and he'll say, "You got a moment?" And then we'll talk for an hour, maybe 2 hours. Sometimes it's walking. One of the things that makes him really different from a Steve Jobs or anybody else is he doesn't just care about the product. He cares about the machine that makes the product, the factory. And so if you're walking in these big tents and Boca Chica where they're doing Starship, or if you're walking in Hawthorne or in Texas on the assembly lines, that's when if you just kind of let him think and process things, he might just start talking and telling stories. And then there'll be times we'll just be sitting in the conference room between meetings. I'll be quiet. And suddenly he'll start recounting stories. And that was the fun part because he's a great storyteller with a real sense of humor when he's in a good mood. And he'll tell you about the 2018 when he was going into meltdown mode, or being on Quash, or the launching of the rockets in 2007 or 2008, and some of the tales of the surges when they had to put 5,000 Teslas out per week and nobody thought they could do it. He will recount those tales. And then after a while, you peel back enough layers and he starts talking about his childhood. He starts talking about his father, things he hasn't really talked about before. And you realize that that's one of the keys is peeling back that layer and letting him talk both about his childhood and his relationship to his father.
So it sounds like there's a lot of volatility just in regards to having a conversation. In one, it's about his past and his childhood, and the next, it might be something pressing going on in his life. How do you handle the volatility going through following a person like Elon?
I think you just be patient when he wants to talk about the material qualities of Inconel and how it's going to work in valves in a Raptor engine redesign. And you're standing under a group of Raptor engines being uh, looking like a spaghetti push because he hasn't simplified them yet. You just let him drill really deep into the material science and the engineering. And then when he kicks back and gets reflective and wants to talk about being beaten up on the playground, and then you're connecting it a bit to owning the ultimate playground, which is what you and I are talking on right now, and Twitter, and you try to have him connect what it was like having to endure what happened to him on the playground and his face being smashed against the steps and what his father did afterwards. And then you understand his feeling about bullying and other things, and you let it connect to current things like why did you want to own the world's ultimate playground, Twitter?
Ooh, and we'll dive into that in just a little bit. But it sounds like some of these, obviously, in the book has not come out. Just letting people in the audience know, it comes out in September, so we are a few months ahead. Truly exciting. Go check it out. You can click on Walter's profile, and there's a link there if you want to learn more.
By the way, you can pre-order it. I don't want to be too much of a shill here, but it's available now for pre-order, and there are links on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and your independent bookstores, and on my Twitter
That was a
profile.
perfect, and I was going to shill for you, actually, Walter. Sounds like you're going to also learn a lot about Elon that you didn't know before. Tell us a story that was surprising to you, right? It doesn't have to be necessarily sad or happy or any of those necessarily emotions, but what was something that was unexpected going through this experience that really surprised you?
I guess the way that the childhood and the father shaped personality and how that affected his understanding of risk, how that affected his, I mean, he's almost addicted to risk, Kimball says. Peter Thiel said when I talked to him, he said most people he's worked with always try to avoid risk. Elon runs also in a desire for drama, both in his personal and in his professional life. He's somebody who feels most comfortable when he's ordered up a hurricane or a surge. All of that connects to events when he was young. And it's an important thing because America has lost the ability to take risks and do great manufacturing. And there's a dark quality to his desire to take risks. It means he shoots off rockets or has full self-driving that he's almost ahead of his skis on. There are many incidents in the book where he does things like kind of ignore the FAA when he wants to shoot up a Starship Heavy test. But the question is our aversion to risk what keeps us from doing most things these days, like building high speed rail. And his addiction to risk is that what allows him to be the only entity getting American astronauts into orbit these days.
Was there ever a moment for you, Walter, where you were following along with Elon, you were with him personally, and you were like, "Oh, fill in the blank with the word right there," but something like he's going through something massive right now, and you are a fly on the wall experiencing that with him. And then obviously you might talk about this in your
Yeah,
book, but and so feel free to share what you may not want to. But now, obviously, the news would be public, so you'd be more open to sharing it.
yeah. There were times, for example, when I was walking with him, once at Starbase down in Boca Chica, once on a solar roof. We were climbing on top of a solar roof that was being installed. Another time, it involved Tesla and creating something where you see him go dark. I mean, it's just the face, his whole demeanor. And it's because people aren't having a maniacal sense of urgency. And I saw that a lot of scenes the first month at Twitter, where he would go dark because people didn't have that maniacal sense of urgency. And you knew what was going to happen. First of all, somebody was going to get reamed out, but secondly, he was going to order a surge. He was going to say, in 10 days, I want everybody to come to Boca Chica, and I want that rocket stacked on the launch pad. And the surges sometimes were meaningless. I mean, he did a surge to stack Starship 18 months before it was going to be ready, but it just extruded the shit out of the system, and it gave everybody that maniacal sense of urgency. That's one of his five principles I talk about in the book. The other times like that, I'd be sitting in a room and he'd be with some poor finance person looking at the cost of components of a Raptor engine. He'd go dark, and I'd know that he was just going to rip the person apart. And there are many scenes in the book where he does that with, I won't name the names now, but you'll see them in the book. They all go on the record with me, where he just is, it's uncomfortable for me to be sitting there at times because he is just brutal about how somebody is fucked up. And the thing that I noticed is that once he finishes doing it, and it was never physical and it was almost done in a flat monotone, but he would just really attack people. Then a few days later, if they had absorbed the lesson, he'd forget about it. It would be as if he went into becoming from Dr. Jekyll to Mr. Hyde and then didn't even think that much or remember that much of how tough he had been on people. And 80% of the time, it was really good. It was like Steve Jobs used to do, except for one order of magnitude, larger. Uh, 80% of the time, it was good, but, 20% of the time, it just made people afraid to give him bad news and that type of thing. So I try to show in the book those moments where he gets into intensity and how effective that can be, but also to some extent how problematic it can
So
be.
when you are there with Elon in those situations, how do you're talking about, I can imagine you experiencing that as a person, right? But also while you're trying to document the situation, how did you handle those situations, maybe when there is a volatile situation, or something obviously very complex going on in Elon's world? Now, part of you, I can imagine, wants to sit back and just document it, take it all in. But is there also an aspect of trying to dig in and maybe get inside the mindset of him? How do you handle those situations, I guess?
Definitely try to dig in. And in quite a few cases, I went back a year later and revisited the incident to see what the outcome was. I went back to see, I'll just use first names, Andy or Lucas or uh, the person who was running Solar Roofs, for example, and say, okay, let's walk that back and see what happened. I also, had to just be an observer. I never intervened, but sometimes I'd ask a Gwen Shotwell, and I'd be told, the reason that young guy on finance screwed up is he just lost a child. His child died 2 weeks earlier. And I'd be tempted to go to Elon and say, you lost a child yourself, an infant child died. And I'd have to wait and let the story play out instead of being like the Heisenberg principle where my observation of the story would affect the story. So sometimes I'd wait a month or two later and let it play out and then ask the question.
Did you always feel this, Walter? I'm trying to put myself in your shoes, where while you're talking with him and you're documenting the process and you're thinking about it as a writer, I can imagine there's also instances when, kind of like what you were just saying, hey, someone in finance just lost a child like you did. Now you're talking to him at a person to person level. Is that right?
Yeah, but I try to make sure I'm there also as a
Mm.
reporter. I'm talking to him person to person, and sometimes I'll ask him abstractly about it, like, what about the empathy, whatever. And as I said a moment ago, I'm somebody who spends a lot of time caring that the people on this Twitter Spaces, that the people I'm having lunch with, that, I try to be pleasing.
Mm.
And I noticed that Steve Jobs didn't do that. And he said, when you have the luxury, he was talking to me, of wearing a velvet glove and always speaking in polite ways that try to please people. But for me, if somebody does something that sucks, I got to tell them it sucks. And if they're a B player, I got to tell them they're a B player. Otherwise, I screw up all of Apple just because I'm trying to be kind to the person in front of me. Exactly the same thing Elon Musk said. He said, it's a form of egotism, meaning of my egotism, not his, that I want to, be too empathetic as opposed to caring about the whole enterprise, caring about the mission. And so this is a complexity in the book, which is we always think a lack of empathy. And here's somebody who's talks about having Asperger's and being on the autism disorder spectrum. Uh, we talk about a lack of empathy as if it makes you a jackass or an asshole or a jerk, which, but we also have to figure out what does it do to an enterprise to have somebody who's maniacally focused on the mission. And it's sometimes not a pretty sight, but he is the only person getting us into the era of electric vehicles. He is the only person shooting American astronauts into orbit. And uh, and that maniacal sense of urgency, I thought, was going to destroy Twitter. I was there night after night where he fired 85% of the people, and I'm thinking, okay, whoa, let's see if it works tomorrow. And yet now Twitter Spaces is working, and video is working, and Rewind is working. So you have to balance that that maniacal sense, that lack of empathy, with also a sense of mission that might get things done. Uh, Claire Boucher, Grimes, once said, "Demon mode. I just don't want to be around him when he's in demon mode. It's just so unpleasant." And then she paused and said, "But demon mode is the one that gets shit done."
Mm, wow, that's powerful. I've not also heard demon mode before. But let's go on that because you started touching on other folks that you've worked with. Obviously, you've written biographies on several influential figures like Steve Jobs and Albert Einstein, Leonardo da Vinci. So, what do you believe sets Elon Musk apart from these individuals? What are those differences in your opinion?
Well, let's take a difference from Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs loved design. Uh, But when he had designed something and thought the chamfers on the iPhone or the curves on the, MacBook Air were beautiful, he almost just threw it over a wall to China and said, okay, you manufacture it. What Musk does is he makes sure his engineers and his designers and himself have desks right on the assembly line so they can watch every time something happens and a red light goes off on the assembly line and they walk to the red, it's called, and you have an iterative process where the designers know how it works with manufacturing. In the US, we've lost our ability to get a fingertip feel for manufacturing, which you need in order to have iterative innovation. By that, I mean, constant innovation to say, here's how we can make something better, here's how we can manufacture things better. That reminded me of, in some ways, the great engineer designers of the time. And it was a maxim of Leonardo da Vinci, which was that he always called himself the engineer and artist for the Duke of Milan, because he knew that the engineering and the making of things were integral to how to making sure you knew how to design it. And so he reminds me of the great engineers who realize that beauty and technology and manufacturing have to be done hand in hand.
Ooh, I love that. I love that. All right, we're almost halfway through, so I just want to
All right, let's get to some questions. I'm there,
Yeah, yeah,
ready.
yeah. And so I'll have another one or two in just a moment. But while I do that, quick reminder, folks, we're having this fantastic conversation with Walter Isaacson, the author of the upcoming biography called Elon Musk, about obviously Elon Musk. So if you have questions about his writing process, about the stories inside, etc., go ahead, raise your hand. I'll bring you up in just a few minutes. Of course, just be as respectful as possible. But we'll be going for about another 25 minutes or so, and then we'll be sure to wrap up. So go ahead, raise your hands, and I will bring you up. But one
I love you. I'm reading the comments. Somebody said they saw me eating with Kimball in Austin, Giga, Texas. Yeah, Kimball's a great guy
That was
too.
actually, so I have personally two more questions for you, and one of them was about the other folks beyond Elon that you had conversations with. I think you said you had over 250 other conversations. What were one or two that stood out to you? You know, maybe it was a fantastic conversation or just truly insightful, that you can share more stories about.
I do think that May Musk, at the very beginning, his mother said to me, uh, how exceptional Elon was. He said, but the danger, she said, is a little. She didn't compare it to Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader, but it's that same trope, which is that Elon becomes his father. And so she's been very insightful about that. Kimball is deeply understanding and sometimes has a contentious relationship. I mean, they were used to wrestle on the floor and bite each other uh, during the early days of before PayPal and Zip2 when they were working together. Um, I did spend a lot of time talking to both Claire Boucher, who is deeply, deeply insightful about Elon and very loving. Likewise, Siobhan Zillis, as you know, is a manager at Neuralink and the mother of two children they share. Um, and then there were just people he works with who truly get him, and it would give me pictures and stories and anecdotes. So the everybody who's in the orbit of Elon is fascinated by Elon. So you just have to push a button and they talk.
Good, good, good. All right, and so I'm going to get to.
The other thing is, the watching how the personal interconnects with the engineering, even the politics. I mean, his politics, as we've seen, has become very anti woke, and that's changed some of his politics from when he was, a donor to Barack Obama and a supporter of Biden. And you have to look at his own, family, things that have happened. As everybody knows, he had Xavier, one of his children, transition to be Jenna, and the way he's processed all of these things, he, I find that the people in his family are very insightful about.
Good, good. And so my last question that I've had saved up this whole time is just, it sounds like, Walter, you have such great conversations with Elon. Of course, there's so many different topics that you can dive into, and you've spoken with so many people. So I'm curious about your process of having to manage of the distillation of all that information about Elon's many ventures and his viewpoints and stories. How did you manage to do all that?
Well, I warn you, the book is 620 pages. So distillation was incredibly difficult to get it down to 620, but I didn't distill it down to, 280 characters or
Mhm.
anything. What I do is I try to be a storyteller. I grew up here in Louisiana, and I had a mentor named Walker Percy. He said there are two types of people come out of Louisiana: preachers and storytellers. He said, for heaven's sake, be a storyteller. The world's got too many preachers. Now, we all know people who have strong opinions that they're, you know, promulgating, many of them smart and good people. I try to just say, all right, I'm going to tell you the story. I'm going to make it a narrative. You're going to walk down the line with him. You can see what he did to the finance guy. You're going to see what happens when we get to the launch pad. I'm going to just tell you the story. And I try to let the reader do the processing. And half the readers are going to come out of this book and say, what an amazing genius. Another half are going to say, okay, he was an amazing genius, but did he have to be such an asshole or tough on these people? And I want the reader to process this and maybe take, he has so many fans that are fanatic fans. I say, okay, but here's some complexities. And likewise, he has amazing number of haters. I want to say, okay, but here's some complexities because it's a human fabric.
I love that human fabric. That's a great way to end on that one. All right, folks, now we're going to jump into the Q&A. I'm super excited about this. We're going to run for the next 20-25 minutes. So, of course, if you're in the audience, go raise your hand. Or if you feel like it, you can also put your comments purple chat bubble in the bottom right. You can also send me a DM if you want. And quick reminder, I'm also going to be giving away 5 pre-ordered copies of this. So if you're interested, at the end, first come, first serve, put your DMs or send me a DM and we will get that to you. Thank you. All right. Herbert, good to see you, my friend. What is on your...
Hey, Adam. Yep. Thank you very much, Walter and Adam. Thank you for doing this. Adam, you are a professional. Thank you for doing this space. You are the best of the best for holding these amazing spaces. You ask the best questions. Walter, I am a massive fan of yours forever. I've read 6 of your books. I've got several questions to ask you. If I can, I'll restrict it to 2. I know Adam will get mad at me. So first is, you're doing this book on Elon Musk, but you've done books on Leonardo, Benjamin Franklin, Einstein. Of course, my favorite up to this point is Steve Jobs. Where will Elon end up in history? And of course, your biography of Elon will play a part. You were saying earlier that it might, affect kind of like the observer affecting history, but your books document history. Where is Elon going to fall into that? I do have a second question. Maybe I'll reserve it till
Yeah,
after.
I do think that the most important thing is to keep the big picture in mind, which is when he started and working with the people at Tesla, we weren't going into the era of electric vehicles. General Motors got rid of its EV. Likewise, when SpaceX was starting, we gave up on the space shuttle and we decided it was going to be decommissioned. So the big picture is that he has led us into these new eras. There are times when people are getting, wringing their knickers about who deserves which blue check mark or something. I think that will fade at a certain point and we'll be able to look at the bigger picture. That said, the personality will be a fascinating and complex one, not something where you can say, this is a simple person.
And Herbert, you can ask a follow-up. Go for it, man.
Yeah, good. So where would his place be in history, though? And then second question is, I think that few know that you were the CEO of CNN, and so I'm just curious what you think about the kind of the media, mass media, and how they are treating Tesla, Elon Musk, and so forth.
Yeah, I don't. I think it's hard to make a broad brush stroke about the media. I think Elon Musk makes a mistake when he says the media is this, the media is that. They're extraordinarily good people who are doing a very good job covering Twitter, covering Tesla, and they're covering it in a critical way. I, I mean, I flinch when he sometimes decides that the media or the mainstream media is this, that, or the other thing. Having been part of the mainstream media, I know it ain't just one thing. And I know that they're really smart, dedicated people who may have an opinions, but I think the beating up on the press, maybe I'm too defensive about it, is unnecessary.
Thank you, guys. Thank you so much, Walter. Appreciate this opportunity.
And I guess you didn't feel you got an answer in the place in
Yes.
history, but I think it's close to what Steve Jobs. It'll be in the pantheon with the Steve Jobs, also with a Henry Ford, who had many flaws, but also understood both design and manufacturing, and in some ways uh, 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 yeah, he reminds me of people who get things done, and I think his place in history is probably greater than any current innovator or leader. I mean, I don't see that Zuckerberg, Bezos quite. I think he will go down more in history. Yeah, when I did Henry, I'll tell a little story. I did Kissinger, and in dealing with a living person, especially one controversial, takes a lot of energy. And I said, okay, next time I'm going to do somebody who's been dead for 200 years. And I did Ben Franklin. And certainly after Steve Jobs, I felt the same way. And I said, I'm going to do somebody who's been dead 500 years. And I went back and did Leonardo. Um, but I do think it's important to write the first draft of history and the second draft of history. If you're not reporting on a living person, you're not sitting next to him watching that person in operation. We learned that from Boswell and being with Dr. Johnson, which is, yeah, there's a downside. Maybe I just have to tell the story, and people a century from now will say, how did he go down in history? Answer that first question. But it's important for those of us who have the chance, the opportunity to be uh, alongside somebody who's living but making a difference, to try to write at least the first draft of that story and to tell it straight. I mean, I try real hard to say, you can make your own judgments here. I'm just going to try to get it exactly the way I saw it and let other people, maybe in future generations even, process it. Yeah, I mean, I'll report every hour and every day, and I keep a chronology, and I have thousands of pages of notes that are in chronological order. Like, all right, 6 p.m., Twitter conference room, looking at spaces and what he's going to do. And I have all my notes that way. And I organize them all chronologically. They're, you know, every interview, every scene. And then I tend to try to organize a book chronologically. Some historians like to jump around, but for me, everything is narrative. One damn thing leads to another. And so if you're writing about that night, he plays Elden Ring all night long and then decides at 5:30 a.m. to make a bid for an offer for Twitter. You also have to then know how that affects 2 days later when he's down in Boca Chica figuring out Starship. So the book, my notes are chronological and the book is chronological. And it may seem mundane, but, you know, open up the Bible. It's got the best lead sentence ever written, which is in the beginning, comma. You got to do it from the beginning and make it chronological.
And how much of like the chronology of it makes sense, but how much of, you know, the information you're gathering is coming from being there in the moment, and then also kind of looking at an outside perspective? Like, how much of the book is kind of written in that sort of outside perspective of, like, do you talk about what other, other people say about him
Well,
and everything?
absolutely. If I go through a meeting or I'm going through a surge or I'm on top of a solar roof or something, I'll then go back to, say, Brian Dow, who was then running Solar Roofs, who's on the roof with me. I'll say, okay, tomorrow I need to talk to you. And then a month later, I'll say, I need to talk to you. And I'll say, okay, what happened right before? How did this all come to pass? Give me the context of this. And that's why you end up with 200 or so interviews, because I go back and say, recreate the scene for me. Now, here's a part of the question you didn't quite ask, but it's it's connected, which is I come on the scene 3 years ago, let's say, but I got to write about the amazing meltdowns and things happening in 2018. So I'm dealing with people, whether it's Sam Teller or Omid Afshar or all these wonderful people, and saying, what happened that morning? What happened that afternoon? Because I want to feel in 2018 the same narrative style that it feels in 2021 when I just happen to be in the meetings. And then, I'm sorry to ramble on this, a third issue I had to face, and y'all be the judge of this, is there are times when I'm in the book where I'm standing there, something's happening, and me being there is part of the story. I tried very hard, and I made my wife read it a couple of times to make sure I don't insert myself into the narrative unnecessarily. But also, I got to be honest with the reader. If me being in a scene or at an event is integral to understanding my observation of it, I do have some first person in there. Well,
It's
his
time.
behaviors are definitely different, and that's where the first complexity comes in, because he has a driven intensity that's different from most of us. And then you get to the flaws that come from that, as well as the strengths that come from that. And what you said a moment ago, Stephanie, is so important, is that we've lost the ability to understand people in their complexities. George Packer wrote a great book about Richard Holbrooke, who was a complex person, and he showed how those complexities wove into the whole tapestry. Well, that's what I tried to do here, which is make you understand. Shakespeare does it very well. Measure for Measure is one of the best plays because it's about how do we take a measure of a person. And in the end, one of the characters, a woman, I'm forgetting the name, says, even the best are molded by their faults. So, what you have to do when you get to complexity is say, yes, these are the faults, but they're molded by the faults. And sometimes for that, they are made the better for it. Shakespeare says it better than I do. But that is what you're talking about, is us regaining the ability not to have hot takes on a person, but to have deeply layered takes on why this person has been so successful, uh, but also has these complexities.
Thank you, Walter. I appreciate that. Adam, thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And so for folks, I'm also getting DMs. I'm getting a lot of messages as well. And so I do want to share one that I absolutely love. It's from a woman in the audience, and she asked that she's curious how Walter approached deciding to wrap up and end this book when Elon's story is so far from over. Walk us through your mindset on that one.
That was really difficult. I've never, when I did Jennifer Doudna, who did CRISPR, I was thinking, okay, how is this going to end? And then suddenly her RNA technology helps create the vaccines that fight COVID, and she wins the Nobel Prize. I said, great, we have a grand ending. And with Musk, it's more difficult, but what happened at the beginning of this year is Starship had its first test launch. He decided to start an AI company, XAI. He, the Twitter situation, he took it over, and it's all sorts of things in those chapters about what really happened behind the scenes at Twitter. But that all happened. And I thought that this was a good time to say, okay, let's pause and take stock. But clearly, there'll be other people, or maybe me, who will write, revised edition paperbacks, but then write the next chapter in Elon's biography.
I love that. I love that, Walter. And so while we're talking about Twitter, and obviously while we're on Twitter and Twitter Spaces, it's a huge passion of mine. What was your overall sense of, as you have this behind the scenes perspective of Elon and everything that he went through? How did that change? How did that evolve from the moment you heard about it till today? And in a way, where do you see Twitter going in the future from Elon's perspective?
I thought at the very beginning when we were in April and in Texas, and he was acquiring the stock and then offered a board seat. I was with him, his brother, with Antonio Gracias, with Ken Howery, many people talking to him. And I thought, this is a really bad fit. He understands engineering, but he doesn't understand, human emotions as well. And he kept saying Twitter is an engineering challenge. I said, no, it's a human relation. It's a human social media thing. It involves advertising. It involves connecting with people's thoughts and emotions. So I thought this is not suited for him. And I do think that he has stepped on many landmines because it's not his natural skill set to take a long time, be reflective, and understand how human emotions are going to be affected by things. On the other hand, his transformation of the engineering surprised me. I mean, on Christmas Eve, for example, he and his cousins, Andrew and James, are flying back to Texas, and they take a U turn on the plane to go to Sacramento and decide on the spur of the moment to pull out the servers. It's an amazing scene in the book with Elon pulling up the tiles on the floor and clipping the cables when people say you can't move these servers. Um, and I thought, okay, that means in January it's not going to work. And we did see things Super Bowl weekend where it was problematic. But watching the engineering, I was stunned by how assertive he was. And I was very glad when he, right after the Starship Monday, when they aborted the takeoff with about 14 seconds left, he flew to Miami, did an ad sales conference, meets Linda Yaccarino for the first time. And I watched this relationship evolve where he realizes she's got a feel for the stuff I don't, which is advertising and relationships on Twitter. And I said, okay, he's going to work his way through this, just as he did on other things. But it hasn't been, it's been a slog through a jungle with a lot of demons coming out during the march.
Ooh, that's an interesting perspective that you just hit on. I never necessarily thought about that, but from a Linda perspective coming into this, and that would have been obviously after you were done with your book, and obviously it's going into publication and stuff like that, right? So that's not.
No. I'm still hanging around with him this April while we're launching Starship, or he is hiring Linda Yaccarino, and I'm talking to her. In fact, I'm still last night, fiddling with things. So I'm making Simon and Schuster run the presses fast.
That's good to hear. Well, can you tell us a little bit more about that? Because I feel like this world is so excited to hear more about Linda, but we don't know anything about her. We're so excited to have her on Twitter.
Well, I come from her world, and I've known her from way back. I think she worked at Turner. I used to work at what was once called Turner Broadcasting, which was part of Time Warner.
So tell us
won't go there. But she's a great person, and she just has a spunky, real feel for human emotions and how to have client relationships. And Elon, whether it's with Gwen Shotwell or many other people, Elon is very good at figuring out who's the right partner to fill in some of the things I'm not going to want to do.
How do you think he's good at doing that? Is there something that you notice specifically that he does to figure that out?
He has a neural network for other people's talents. Like for Gwen Shotwell, I have the scene on the runway where he's asking her to be the president of SpaceX. What's the second layer of that, which took me a longer time to sort through, is you have to also have a self-awareness. And I was thinking Musk is not sometimes self-aware about some of his flaws. But then I realized, oh, yeah, he is. And it's an engineering problem for him. It's like, what components are missing and what's the best way to add them? And Linda's going to be just super and fun at this job.
Good. Wow. Well, hey, folks, this has been a tremendous conversation. And Walter, I'm sure we could talk all day long, not only about the book and all the stories, but we don't want to give out too much. Of course, we want people to be able to check out the book. So quick reminder, the book is launched September 12th, I believe. So in a couple months, we've been talking and diving in deep about the process of Walter Isaacson's writing of the book and experiences and all the great stories. So I want to promote that, as well as I'm going to be giving away 5 pre-ordered copies of it. So if you haven't already, send me a DM and I'll get to the first 5, whoever was in my inbox already. But Walter, this is truly a pleasure, and I hope we can do it again. Thank you so much for your time.
Adam, you're a very good moderator.
Well, I appreciate that, Walter. And yes, again, my name is Adam Salkovich, also known as the best of live audio. I absolutely love hosting these conversations with great, fascinating thinkers and doers like Walter. There's many more to come, so I hope you'll stick around. I thank you for joining us, and I hope you all have a great rest of the day. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Wow, that was quite impressive. He interviewed over 200 people to write this book, and I'm looking forward to reading all of these 600 pages. And he witnessed Elon's demon mode. I will be mentioning that maybe sometimes in the videos going forward, especially at the end of each quarter when Tesla is doing a delivery push or when someone makes a mistake. Yeah, it's interesting how Elon can be really tough on someone, and then days later, it's as if it never happened, assuming that they learned the lesson. You can already pre-order this book, and I will definitely be buying a copy for myself and maybe a few more copies as gifts for other people too. Anyway, this has been really awesome, and I will see you in the next video. YouTube wants you to watch this video next, but if you haven't seen this Elon Musk interview, then watch this one.